Got dreams of being a professional podcaster, but have no idea what you're doing?
This is impossible.
That's about to change.
A new kind of school.
Welcome to the Pod School Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the final show of 2019. How the hell did we get here this quickly? I don't mean to sound like my father, who is constantly talking about time passing, but geez Louise, I feel like this year didn't even exist. So in honour of that, I thought I would dip back and actually finish the year with an update of an earlier episode. You might have already seen this in the feed, but holy cow, have things changed a lot in the podcasting space. And when I recorded this episode, things like Spotify for podcasters and Google Podcasts did not exist. Can you imagine that there was ever a time? So I wanted to make sure that I had a fresh version of this topic in the feed because it is a very, very important part of podcasting. The first step in getting your show listened to by ears other than yourself and potentially your mother or father is to get it into podcast directories. By that, I mean things like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Pocket Casts. There are a bunch of different ones out there, and you can just Google a list and submit until your heart's content, or you can just submit to a few and you'll find that your show will actually be on a lot that you didn't submit to because often podcast apps will pull the feed from iTunes. So which directories should you submit your show to? The first is obviously Apple Podcasts, which used to be iTunes, which is still the majority of listens. Podcasting used to be a very iPhone-heavy practice, but since Google Podcasts stepped in a big way, that has opened up the listenership in Android. Ditto with Spotify, because Spotify is platform agnostic. Unfortunately, for a long time, even though Android users are a huge portion of the worldwide population, they were often getting forgotten about in the podcasting space. So since things have changed up a little bit with new players stepping in, Apple listeners have definitely gone down as a percentage of overall listeners. I've noticed my shows, they've gone from sort of 80% to high 60s or 70%, but they are still a huge player in the podcasting space, and it is essential that you have your show on Apple Podcasts. In terms of submitting to directories, I will put a link in the description of this episode to an article that I've got that shows you how to do that. It is really a simple process of just copying the RSS feed, which is just a URL in the back end of your podcast host, and submitting it to different pages. On the show notes of this episode, which you'll also find in the description, I've got a list and links to all of the different podcast directories that I mentioned. So actually submitting your show is a simple process, and it only needs to be done once. And that's when you first put some audio into the feed of your podcast. You submit that feed to the podcast directories. Once you have registered, every time you upload a new piece of audio to your feed, it will automatically pop up in the directories. Sometimes, if it's feeling a little lazy, it won't go up immediately, but you at least don't have to do anything more than just submit your show that one time. That is Apple Podcasts out of the way. Google Podcasts is a second place that's very important because that covers your Android listeners. Google likes to do things itself. It likes to crawl the website and find your podcast. Since it does things that way, you want to make sure that everything is set up correctly for Google to find it. If you've got a podcast host that's like a major platform, usually everything will be set up fine. I will pop a link in the show notes of this episode, which again, you will find in the description, to a page where you can actually drop your RSS feed in and test the link to see if it's working, and you'll get a little green message or a little red message. Just give yourself some space after releasing your first episode before you start kind of writing the angry letters into Google saying, where the hell am I? I've seen some of the shows that we've created at Mamamia where I'm head of podcasts there, sometimes maybe take 2-3 weeks to turn up in Google Podcasts. So if it's any longer than that, then, I'd sort of be looking into things. And certainly if you're concerned about it, you should be able to contact your podcast host who will be able to help you to make sure everything's set up correctly, because really it shouldn't take too much toing and froing from you for Google to find your show. The other platform that is now essential to be on is Spotify. They have stepped into the podcasting space in a really major way, and they are doing all that they can to really help a problem that a lot of us have had, which is discoverability. And that means getting new shows in front of new people's ears. There are a lot of Spotify users, and Spotify are really putting podcasts front and center on their interface. So you'll notice if you're a Spotify user, you'll see a music tab and a podcast tab. You also might have noticed something that they've just introduced recently, which is your daily podcast playlist that is very similar to other suggested playlists that they have, like your release radar, where they will throw into the mix shows that you might not have heard. They'll also throw up some new episodes of shows that you've listened to before, but they also will just tap into their magical little algorithm and give you some suggestions for podcast episodes that are similar to other shows that you've listened to, but that you might not have checked out before. This is a game changer in terms of getting shows in front of ears that might not have found them before. So you want to make sure that your show is on Spotify so that it can be a part of that mix and you can have listeners find your show there as well. The other place you can have your show is on SoundCloud. I have never really experienced a huge amount of downloads from SoundCloud, so I tend to not bother about uploading purely because I'm just trying to simplify the process of podcasting. And so another place to upload audio is a bit of a punish. And also you have to pay an increased subscription on top of that if you want to house a certain amount of audio. And so it all just became a bit of a punish for me. So I didn't do it. But there are people that use SoundCloud as well as a platform to get listens on their show. I tend to think that SoundCloud is better as a promotional platform. So I'll often upload snippets from my show and I will share them out on social media. It's great because those snippets will play directly in Twitter so that you can actually play them natively so they don't have to click out anywhere. So I find SoundCloud really good as a promotional platform, but not necessarily as a place to house your podcast. It's much more important to have it in directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts for sure. But by all means, if you just love good old SoundCloud and you're attached to it and you don't mind uploading the audio there and you're happy to pay an upgraded subscription, then by all means go for it. There are some other platforms that are great to drop your show into: Stitcher, TuneIn, Pocket Casts. I will link to a bunch of other directories in the show notes of this episode, as I said. And if you got time on your hands, I mean, just go nuts. You copy and paste until your heart's content. But you don't really need to be in every single podcast directory that was ever created. What you do need to ensure is that your show can be listened to by people on both Android and iPhone. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify at a bare minimum. The other thing you want to make sure is that you are always sharing your show using a universal link. And that is a link that will work on all phones. So if you send out a link to your show in Apple Podcasts, if somebody is on an Android phone and they click on that, they will go to Internet Purgatory, which is no fun. I have another episode that you can find in this feed, so just scroll on back and look for the episode on universal links or sharing your show with one link, where I take you through the ways that you can share your show that means everybody can click on it and listen to it, because that's very important. You don't want to say, hey, listen to this episode, and then have somebody go, okay, I will. Thank you for sending me nowhere. That's not a nice experience. So there you go. Go forth, copy that RSS feed and shove it into as many directories as you want. And hopefully the listeners will flood, or more likely trickle in. But remember, podcasting is a marathon, not a sprint, so a trickle is just fine. I hope you have a wonderful break over the holidays. I will be taking a break for a couple of weeks, and I will be back early in January 2020 with more tips on the Podschool podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, if you want more help creating your podcast, please check out my online podcasting course, Podschool, that you can find at podschool.com.au. I will see you not next week, but next year. Holy heck. And until then, happy podcasting.
That's all for today.